to our next high noon lecture. We're continuing the filming only option. We're live streaming it on social media. The video will be available online afterwards, of course, so if you've missed it or you can't watch the whole thing today, it's still available, I promise. We are really excited about a lot of the lecture presentations that we have coming up. Our next one will be July 30th with Barbara Van Cleve, who is a Montana ranch photographer, and her photos are stunning. So go ahead and mark your calendars now for July 20th. We also have our Hoof It with a Historian walking tour series. They're continuing. We have one tonight, Thursday, then and now, and then our next one will be next Friday. But now that I have gone through all of that, I am really excited to introduce Nancy Mahoney today. She's going to be presenting on Indians, amateurs, and archaeologists, looking at collecting in Montana until about 1950. It's a really interesting and nuanced time period for us. Nancy has been interested in archaeology from a very young age, and she teaches about human prehistory from the Paleolithic to the present. Before moving to Montana in 2005, she participated in archaeological projects in Cyprus, Morocco, Turkey, Utah, and Arizona. Quite a varied location there. Now she keeps her fieldwork closer to home and is focused on the history of archaeology in Montana. Nancy has been an instructor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at MSU since 2007, and that's in Bozeman. And she's currently a doctoral candidate in American Studies. She holds a BA from Emory University, an MA from George Washington University, both in anthropology, as well as a doctoral candidacy in archaeology from Arizona State University. Although Nancy loves being a lifelong learner, that's why we get along so well, she hopes to complete her doctorate by the end of 2020 and finally put an end to grad student life once and for all. Yes. We will pray for that, we will bless that, we will send you good vibes for all of that. So with that, I'll turn the podium over to Nancy and we'll see what she's got for us.
All right, thanks everyone for being here, all of you here in the room and all of you who might be watching or watching this later. I want to thank the Western Heritage Center, especially Kevin Koister, for asking me to participate in your High Noon series. This is a really awesome series. So I have a slightly different title than what I originally sent. Today I'm going to talk about amateurs and archaeologists. And I've dropped the third member of that group, and a history of artifact collecting in Montana between 1880 and 1980. So I'm rushing over a 100-year period. But I'm going to start at the present and discuss with you one of the current dilemmas that create tension between amateurs and archaeologists. I'll take you a little bit back through the history of archaeology in Montana, to better understand sort of these current tensions and hopefully to see a way forward. The thesis that I'm working toward here is this. In many ways, the heritage preservation laws that have been designed to preserve archaeological sites and protect them have been good at doing that, but they've also led to shifts in professional archaeological practice, where it has moved more onto public lands from private lands. And this has had overall somewhat of an adverse impact on professional and amateur relations, the relationship between those two groups in Montana, and I'll argue overall on the preservation of sites, especially those off of public lands. So as you've heard in my introduction, I teach anthropology at MSU, and I've been trained as an archaeologist and worked in many places, but now mostly work here in Montana, so I decided to focus on the history. Nearly every time I meet someone and they ask me what I do, they inevitably want to tell me about an artifact that they found. Who wouldn't, right? It's so exciting to hold one in your hand. I love hearing about it, that thrill of finding an artifact, especially the first time. And when you're holding it, something that is an object that was made and used by people centuries ago, maybe even thousands of years ago, it's somewhat of a mystical experience. And it's about having something from the past physically here in the present. Historian David Lowenthal writes very eloquently about relics and our attraction to them. But then people often go on and ask me if I could give them some specific information about the artifacts in their collection. Metaphorically, this is often what archaeologists are feeling when a collector asks us to do that. We often clam up and get that deer in the headlights look. As archaeologist Bonnie Pitblado has said, we employ sort of a risk avoidance strategy, which involves overlooking or outright avoiding interactions with amateurs and collectors because of the ethical concerns we have surrounding engagement with and collaboration with collectors. Simply put, we're wondering if we should talk with them or not. Will it do more harm than good? This is what we worry about. We've been taught that if we engage or collaborate with collectors, we inadvertently provide validation of their collections, which might encourage them to keep collecting, or worse, aid them in making a sale of those artifacts. And we worry about this because it can often result in further damage to archaeological sites, as well as our ability to then understand the past. And so for the past 5 decades, we have mostly sought out ways to avoid engaging with collectors and amateur archaeologists. Yet it's important to point out that artifact collecting on private lands remains legal and a vigorously defended activity. So our lack of engagement hasn't put a stop to the practice. I was saying it's important to point out, though, that artifact collecting is legal on private land, and it remains a vigorously defended activity. And the lack of engagement with archaeologists has not put a stop to that practice. So recently, this has led many professionals to rethink this deer in the headlights risk avoidance stance, because I think archaeologists risk losing more than they gain by marginalizing or even just ignoring collectors. And here's an example of what I mean. David Bradley wanted to do, Here's an example of what I mean. In June 2018, I was put in touch with a landowner in central Montana that had a bison kill site on his ranch. This is David Bradley. He's a bobcat. So he called us at MSU, and he wanted to know if MSU would consider coming out to excavate the site and perhaps involve school kids, members of his church, members of the community. The site was first found over a decade ago by his friend James Bergstrom, who had actually been leasing the ranch from him. With David Bradley's permission, Mr. Bergstrom started excavating portions of the site or digging it because he was really interested in collecting projectile points, these very beautiful Avonlea points that are found at this archaeological site. Mr. Bergstrom had always had a fascination with history and archaeology, but David Bradley, the landowner, became concerned because more and more members of his community were asking permission to come out and dig for points. And as you can see, they were leaving really large stretches of the site exposed, and bison bones out to weather and deteriorate on the surface. The stratigraphy was becoming all jumbled. For an archaeologist, it's very hard to look at a site and a picture like that. David Bradley wanted to do what was right, but he felt that unless the university were to take an interest in the site, he would have a hard time turning down the request to dig from members of his community, his friends. The Bradley Ranch is located near the dead center of Montana, where the star is on this map. It's outside the small town of Garneal, which is just north of Judith Gap. All around him are private ranches, most of which contain teepee rings, artifact scatters, probably very likely other bison kill sites. But this information about archaeological sites is really known only to the locals. These sites have never been recorded, and they do not exist in the database managed by the State Historic Preservation Office of Archaeological Sites. We looked, there is a big gap in the center of Montana where all these private ranches are. David Bradley's neighbors have been wary of his decision to involve the university. They're fearing that archaeologists will want to appropriate their land, they might want to talk to the government, take their artifact collections, something like that. there's a great deal of mistrust and misunderstanding. Around Judith Gap, the local landowners are much more likely to grant private collectors access to sites on their property than they are a professional archaeologist. Oops. I wanted to understand how things got this way. And to do so, I knew I needed to take a closer look into the history of archaeological practice in Montana. What I mean by that is how the practice of collecting and investigating the past by both engaged amateurs and professionals unfolded in Montana. I wanted to understand why it is that people who care deeply about the same thing have come to be in such opposition and hold so much mistrust of each other. So I want to start by really defining what I mean by an engaged amateur, what I mean and what I don't mean. So it's a subset of the general public, ranging from avocationalists who are very dedicated and do it often, to more casual collectors, but only those who collect legally from private lands with permission from landowners. I am not talking about people who buy and sell artifacts, or who knowingly loot or vandalize sites, or knowingly and purposely collect illegally off public lands. So the people I will be referring to throughout this presentation are those who collect from sites on private property with landowner permission, and I'll be using amateur and collector interchangeably to refer to those people. So the research I've been doing, which is the basis for today's talk, has been a sort of history with a mission. I want to better understand the past in order to impact the present, to create opportunities for collaboration that might improve trust as well as the conditions for heritage preservation, the conditions in which archaeological sites will be better preserved. But before I delve into that history, I'm going to zoom in and talk a little bit about relations between amateur archaeologists and collectors over time. And I want to start here. This is a good starting point, the Antiquities Act of 1906. The relationship between professionals and amateurs in American archaeology has been a topic of debate since the formalization of the discipline in the early 20th century, late 19th century. So the Antiquities Act was passed in 1906, and what that act did was to make it illegal for anyone to collect or excavate sites on public lands without a permit. The only people who could obtain the permits in order to collect or excavate on public lands were those who already held positions at universities or museums. So this excluded the majority of the people who were often finding the sites and locating the sites for professionals who would come out from the East Coast or other institutions. Also, the Antiquities Act made archaeologists the sole stewards and authorities over ancestral sites, artifacts, art, and remains of indigenous peoples found on public lands. So this law was passed without any consultation with tribes, with Native American people about their own remains, artifact sites, what they would like to see happen with them. And that's true of all the preservation laws until we get to 1990 with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Now, archaeologists have long recognized that amateur interest and labor has been integral to the development and growth of the discipline of archaeology. Amateurs find sites, they often share information, they often donate collections, analyze artifacts, participate in fieldwork, and sometimes publish research and field reports in journals. But beginning in the late 19th century, there were concerns over relic hunting and relic hunting for the curio market, and the looting and destruction of archaeological sites, particularly those in the Southwest, often put amateurs and professionals in this vehement opposition to each other. Dozens of journal articles spanning each decade of the 20th and 21st centuries demonstrate that there have been ongoing concerns over the activities of amateurs and collectors and the destructive impact that they can have on heritage preservation. So this has been a long-standing concern from the beginning of this discipline and still is today. However, there are some archaeologists who've worked quite closely with amateurs and collectors, and recently they've brought a different perspective to the conversation. So here's a list of scholars who have worked closely with collectors and whose research I'm drawing from in this next section. So the scholars I've listed here have taken an ethnographic approach and talked directly with amateurs and collectors. They've conducted interviews and oral histories and surveys. And from that research, there are three key points that have emerged about non-professional artifact collecting. First, legal artifact collecting on private land continues to thrive and is unlikely to be abated by education programs alone. Second, the history of plains archaeology has been largely dependent on the knowledge and collections of amateurs who have identified the vast majority of key sites. Bonnie Pitblato, in a 2014 article, makes an argument for ethical and proactive archaeologist-collector collaborations, and she shows how collaborations with collectors has been beneficial not only to the discipline of archaeology, but to the public in general. Specifically, she documents that 80% of Paleo-Indian sites have been found by local collectors. These are the earliest inhabited sites in North America. They're older than 12,000 years old, and they're difficult to find. They're deeply buried, and many of them exist on private land. Finally, the surveys and ethnographies of collectors demonstrate that there is actually considerable overlap in the attitudes and motivations of professionals and avocationals toward heritage. Some archaeologists are even advocating that artifact collecting can be reframed and understood as a form of meaningful social practice that connects collectors to place and heritage, increases everybody's value of these special places. My own interviews with collectors in Montana has revealed there is indeed a similar overlap in the practices and motivations of amateurs and professionals. Collectors in central and southeast Montana discuss artifact hunting as part of their identity within a broader community that includes collectors, interested amateurs, and educators. Many of them have family histories of collecting, and so collecting is a practice associated with their personal connections to landscape and heritage. Most of these collectors engage in non-destructive legal collecting of surface materials. They keep mental and physical records of where each item was found, and none of them buy or sell artifacts. The collectors that I interviewed all share information with each other, either informally or at more formal gatherings, but they often do not report findings to professionals, who they complain are, quote, secretive and stingy. And this is because professionals will often refuse to share information about where sites are located and access to collections in return with amateurs. And this is often because these sites are on public lands, they're sensitive sites, they could be important to Native Americans in a more ritual religious sense that something is happening. There can be concern over vandalism, looting, so there's often good reasons for that secrecy, but it has been creating a situation of mistrust and misunderstanding between the two groups. Okay, on to the history. Montana was the last state in the lower 48 to attract professional archaeologists, and consequently it has actually relied on amateur knowledge and experience until quite recently in comparison to other states. This fact, almost paradoxically, is what has laid the groundwork for some of the present mistrust and resentment between professionals and non-professionals. So I'm going to briefly discuss what I see as 4 historical phases in Montana archaeological practice. First is what I call sort of the BP phase, 1880 and 1930, before professionals. So during that time period until 1930, we didn't have any professionals in Montana. The second phase, 1930 to about 1945, is this era of New Deal archaeology, works progress administration projects, WPA projects, and all of a sudden Montana started to gain national attention of the archaeology that we had here. In 1945 to 1960, we have the third phase, which is a golden age for amateurs and the beginning of university archaeology and collaboration. And fourth, 1960 to 1990, broad professionalization of archaeology was occurring across the nation as well as in Montana. And that was the same time period where we have stricter and more enforceable heritage preservation legislation, led to the rise of cultural resource management, which is non-academic archaeology, private firms who often do compliance work. And this last phase is significant because it meant that there were changes in how and why archaeology was being done, as well as where it was being done. And it's this phase and what went on that ultimately led to a marginalization of amateurs from archaeological practice, and then a growing division between them and professionals. Similar to other parts of the Great Plains, Montana was on the margins during national trends toward professionalization in the earliest 20th century. This is likely due to a number of factors, including the relatively late settlement of Euro-Americans in this region, persistently low population densities, and importantly, the more modest material remains left behind by the indigenous people that inhabited this region, especially all the northwestern plains. The semi-nomadic tribes of Montana's plains did not leave behind the multi-story architecture built of stone, complexes of large burial mounds, things that we see in the American Southwest or the Southeast and the Midwest. Ethnographers had come in the late 1800s and early 1900s. George Bird Grinnell, later Alfred Kroeber, Clark Whistler, to document what they saw as this majestic plains culture, but which they also saw as a vanishing plains culture. They paid little attention when they were here documenting what they saw was the last of Plain Indians to the material remains or the archaeological record. We do have some mention of archaeological sites by Lewis and Clark. We also have a few reports from military expeditions, usually associated with Yellowstone Park. And until the 1930s, though, anthropologists in general and archaeologists presumed that there really wasn't much archaeology at all in Montana. They presumed that the cold, arid northern plains were too harsh to have been occupied year-round before Native Americans had acquired the horse. They believed plains cultures lacked any significant depth and that they were recent migrants to the area. They also presumed that mobile foragers left little behind, sites would lack any stratigraphy, any serious depth, and so there wouldn't be good preservation. So there was very little work done and very few professionals that ever visited before 1930. Sustained archaeological fieldwork only began in the second phase with the advent of the Montana Archaeological Survey, which was a project run under the National Youth Administration, and also the excavations at Pictograph and Ghost Cave, which all of you who are in Billings are familiar with Pictograph Cave State Park. These were conducted under the aegis of the Works Progress Administration beginning in 1936 and 37. The cave sites had amazing preservation and deep stratigraphy, not what anyone was expecting to find. They attracted national attention and the attention of archaeologists and anthropologists, a lot of scholars, as well as a lot of tourism. It changed the way people thought about archaeology in the region. There were also excavations of the Hagen site near Glendive and a site in Red Lodge, but really Pictograph and Ghost Caves were the one that caught most of the popular and scholarly attention. The WA projects were initiated by Melville Sayer, who arrived in Montana in 1932 as an English professor at the Montana School of Mines in Butte. He was the first to teach archaeology there, thinking that miners might find archaeological remains, and also because he just had a personal interest in archaeology. But Sayer had no formal training at all. So even though he was an academic himself, he was essentially just a well-educated amateur. He enlisted engineering students to survey and map Pictograph and Ghost Cave, and hired Oscar Lewis as foreman to oversee the excavation. Lewis was an autodidact and a self-taught amateur archaeologist, originally from Glendive. He'd come to Montana as a young cowboy, and in 1918 homesteaded 320 acres southeast of Glendive. After years of drought and economic depression, he, his wife, and his daughter abandoned the ranch in search of relief work and found it with the WPA. And by the time Sayer met him, Lewis was already widely recognized as a local expert on the archaeology of southeast Montana. The WPA projects were the first formal attempt to document sites and conduct formal excavations in Montana. And like many other WPA projects, they were essentially run by amateurs. But that changed in 1940 with the arrival of William Molloy, who took over the project after Sayer had been let go or fired at the end of 1938 for various problems. He just had a lot of vision, no management skills whatsoever, and potentially other issues. he moved artifacts from the site and from Butte to a lab in Lewistown, and some of you who are here in Billings know that whole history, and unfortunately some of those artifacts we don't think all made it back together. So there was some problems there. But after Sayre was fired, the National Works Progress Administration pushed to have professional and academically trained individuals take over the project and ensure reporting, which is why Molloy was hired. Bill Molloy was a young graduate student from the University of Chicago when he arrived here in Billings in October of 1940. And he supervised a final season of excavations at Pictograph and Ghost Caves, as well as a season at the Billings Bison Trap. He also worked closely with Oscar Lewis to collect data on several other significant sites in the region. Though Lewis kept daily field notes as the foreman, he never tried to publish anything on his own. He only had a 9th grade education, and Lewis struggled to write in the manner appropriate for archaeological journals. So Molloy ended up publishing the reports on several significant sites in Montana, all of which were originally discovered by Lewis and collected by him. So there are a few brief reports on some artifacts Lewis found that they co-published, but everything else was published by Molloy. So this is sort of this beginning in the WPA period heading out of the amateur and professional divide. So I just wanted to show you, here is an artifact found by Oscar Lewis near Glendive. It's a bison head effigy carved into sort of pumice stone. Here is a drawing of it that was published by Molloy and Lewis together in American Antiquity at the time. Here are artifacts from Pictograph and Ghost Cave, many that Lewis had collected and described to Molloy, so when he came later he understood. And a lot of these collections are all right now at the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman. Collections from the Hagen site, which Lewis found, originally excavated, and then Molloy ended up writing up. 30 Mile Mesa is another one that Lewis found, Molloy eventually wrote up. Molloy was good about acknowledging Lewis, but as we'll see, that wasn't quite enough. So this is probably a drawing of this rock art site that a lot of you are familiar here in Billings. Is this in the airport or something like that? Is there some, does anyone know? Anyway, it's a well-known scene that they think could have been Lewis and Clark coming down in a boat. Okay, so Molloy began publishing WPA reports, and eventually his career took off. He was always careful to credit Lewis in publications, but Lewis still ended up feeling resentful and that he didn't get the credit he ultimately deserved. The WPA fieldwork ended in 1942 when the US entered World War II, and Molloy was drafted. He became an officer. Lewis went on to take a job building the Alcon Highway, and Melville Sayre actually had passed away by 1942. He was in poor health and passed away in 1941. So this group of amazing men who had really brought professional archaeology and national attention to Montana were all gone, and archaeology was on hiatus. After the war, Karl Malouf was hired by the University of Montana in 1948. This is sort of the golden age phase for archaeology for amateurs. This is when we had national attention, people knew there were things. It was in all the local newspapers, and amateurs really started to get out and find sites and try to contact people at the Smithsonian and everywhere else. Karl Malouf had been hired in 1948, University of Montana, so there was someone people could go to ask questions and collaborate with. The river basin surveys that were run by the Smithsonian occurred during this period in the 1950s and early 60s. And this was the time period in which the very first archaeological societies were founded in Montana. So begins the golden age for amateurs, as well as university archaeology collaborations. Molloy was also hired the same year as Karl Malouf. They were both friends, but at the University of Wyoming. So he went on to continue publishing about Montana at University of Wyoming, Molloy did, and then eventually switched to work on archaeology on Easter Island, had a pretty amazing career. When Karl Malouf was hired, he had not yet completed his PhD, and yet at that time, Malouf was the only professionally credentialed archaeologist in the entire state. Karl Malouf was as tireless as he was gregarious, and immediately sought out information and collaboration with local amateurs and landowners. At UM, he began the Anthropology and Sociology paper series, and as his editor, he actually relied heavily on amateur and student contributions, often co-publishing archaeological reports with individuals such as Thane White, Roy Austin, Susan Hand, Ed McAfee, and many others. In 1949, Malouf was quoted in the Missoulian newspaper in October 6th of 49 as praising the cooperation of local farmers and amateur collectors because Montana still remained one of the least states known archaeologically. So it was sort of all hands on deck. Even though he was a professional, he was really relying on the knowledge of all of the amateurs that were living here. Also during the 1950s, the Smithsonian River Basin surveys brought salvage archaeology to Montana, preservation and compliance work to do archaeology before dams were built and large areas were flooded and sites were lost forever. The river basin surveys employed field crews that were often entirely made up of avocationalists and amateurs, some of even whom held supervisory positions, analyzed artifacts, and wrote things up. So throughout the 1950s, archaeology in Montana remained very much an amateur endeavor. Things began to change in the late 1950s and early 1960s when several local amateur societies were formed, most notably the Billings Archaeological Society, which started to get going in 1958, the Milk River Archaeological Society in 1962, and then alongside those, the first statewide archaeological organization also started up, the Montana Archaeological Society. These three societies were organized, managed, and populated by a range of enthusiastic avocationalists, amateurs, and collectors. The members met regularly, held annual meetings, worked with public land managers, recorded and excavated sites on public lands, published reports in local newsletters, and occasionally in regional journals such as Plains Anthropologists. So at this time, amateurs and professionals were working alongside each other, especially in these archaeological societies. Most of the sites they were working on were on private lands. And then things began to change, and there began to be more concern with the damage that unstructured collecting could be doing to sites. And this is when we start hearing about the term pot hunting and more denigrating of the work that some amateurs were doing or some people were doing. So today, the meaning of the term pot hunter seems self-evident, and it has become a common idiom across the United States to refer to anyone who legally or illegally damages archaeological sites during a quest to collect artifacts. It is widely believed to have its origins really in the hunt for pots in southwestern sites, intact vessels in the American Southwest, the Pueblo sites. However, a thorough search in both newspapers and scholarly journals reveals that it originally had a very different meaning. During the 19th century, pot hunting was a derogatory term applied to individuals who took part in competition purely to win a prize or a pot. So these two gentlemen here on this 1903 novel called The Pot Hunters, they were schoolboys that were trying to recover these lost trophies that were stolen from games that they had won them in. So in those cases, pots referred to trophies or awards. It did not commonly refer to looting or vandalism of archaeological sites until after 1900. During the early 20th century, the moniker pot hunter became most frequently used to describe various kinds of unethical hunting activity rather than archaeological vandalism. Pot hunting was essentially equated with poaching, in that a pot hunter was careless with regard to hunting methods and sought only food or trophies. And sportsmen during the late 19th century, during the burgeoning conservation movement, criticized pot hunters as being very unethical. They argued that pot hunters or poachers benefited financially from the private appropriation of public land resources, and that their hunting practices were ultimately unsustainable and damaging to all. The shift in meaning of pot hunter to a hunter of relics can be traced to a 1903 article in American Anthropologist. T. Mitchell Pruden was the first archaeologist to use the term in print to refer to amateur and commercial relic hunters who were seeking intact pots for resale. For decades in the 19th century, it was common knowledge that the intact vessels, Pueblo painted pots, could be found in burial mounds throughout the American Southwest. So Pruden complained that the locals had become so prolific at locating graves and unearthing vessels for the curio market that there would be soon nothing left for archaeologists. So the term after that slowly caught on nationally. By 1952, linguists actually recognized the term pot hunter as a standard term in professional jargon used by archaeologists that would signify literally one who hunts for pots, one who digs up prehistoric objects without regard for the information that may be in the ground with them. Then by the early 1960s, the term pot hunter broadened. It was used more broadly to describe any destructive activity, vandalism, looting of all types of archaeological finds. And for the American archaeologists, it became synonymous with the idea of a less serious-minded arrowhead or curio collector. So not even just somebody damaging sites, but somebody just picking things off the surface. The word became shorthand for a way to distinguish ethical from unethical practices, not necessarily legal from illegal, but ethical from unethical. And then eventually in 1961, the word made it into Webster's dictionary. So although this term pot hunter was commonly used by archaeologists across the United States between 1903 and the late 50s, early 60s, we have no record that the word pot hunter was ever used in Montana, at least publicly, until 1959. So again, Montana is kind of late to this whole momentum and division between amateurs and professionals. Interestingly, its earliest public use in Montana coincides with the establishment of the first archaeological societies here. And it seems to represent an effort to begin distinguishing between avocationalists and highly educated amateurs on the one hand, and their less reputable compatriots, artifact hunters and collectors on the other. So Mr. Francis Niven, a Bozeman merchant and himself an amateur archaeologist, he first used the term pot hunter during a presentation about Montana archaeology he gave to the Quest for Knowledge Club in Bozeman. After that, the term pot hunter starts showing up frequently in archaeological society meeting records and publications. And in 1961, Karl Malouf, who had formerly been praising the efforts of local landowners and amateurs who he was collaborating with, was quoted in the Billings Gazette, now referring to the threats of vandalism and amateur pot hunters who collect artifacts with little knowledge or regard for data essential to historic research. So this quote by Malouf is emblematic of a major change in tone, as most collectors became rebranded as pot hunters and seen as a threat to science and heritage, which marks a measurable shift in practice away from collaboration towards more opposition. Montana was late to adopt the term pot hunter and late to establish its own archaeological societies. But by the late 1960s, we began to see an increased focus on heritage preservation. The National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966, and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act was passed in 1979. These laws were stricter and more enforceable than the 1906 Antiquities Act, and were designed to protect and preserve historical and archaeological sites on public lands only. And they do a good job at that. All across the country, these stricter regulations ended up also being a huge boost to employment opportunities for archaeologists, especially those working outside of academia. Archaeologists were now essential to meet the compliance needs of federal agencies. So NAGPRA came a lot later, and as I said earlier, that was the first time we have actual consultation with tribes over how to handle and who has authority over their ancestral indigenous remains. However, the legislation, the Historic Preservation Act and the Archaeological Protection Act, had more immediate consequences here in Montana. First, student enrollment went up in archaeological programs, and students and professionals began to outnumber avocationals on regional projects. 2, public land agencies stopped granting excavation and survey permits to amateur societies. And 3, the stricter laws brought about divisions within amateurs in the same society, primarily between avocationals who would adopt professional ethics and non-collecting policies and amateurs who remained interested in collecting on private property. There started to be a division. As these divisions solidified, Montana's local amateur societies actually dissolved, and only the most dedicated avocationalists remained as contributing members to the state society, Montana Archaeological Society. The majority of collectors and rural landowners left these organizations and formed their own informal networks for sharing information. So one measure of the declining relations among amateurs and professionals between 1960 and 1990 is the rate at which papers by amateurs were published in the journal Archaeology in Montana. And so this is a journal associated with the organization Montana Archaeological Society. So often you would give a paper and then it would become published. Now, journal publications are not a direct correlate of amateur participation, but these data do capture the degree to which amateur contributions were encouraged and valued, and so they serve as a sort of proxy to measure the degree to which amateurs were engaged with professionals. Through journal publications, amateurs and professionals were involved in relationships of reciprocity and mutual respect. So we see that in 1958 through 1969, the first decade or so, the majority of the papers published were by amateurs. And then we see 20 years later that only 18% are published by amateurs. So the publication data reflects the declining involvement by amateurs as much as it does the increasing participation by growing numbers of academic, cultural resource management, and agency professionals in Montana. And underlying this, it also reflects a shift in where archaeology is happening. Field work during this period also moved onto public lands, BLM, Forest Service, national park lands, through paid work contracts that required official permits. The shift to public lands meant that rural landowners and amateur collectors had fewer opportunities to develop relationships with professionals seeking field sites. And that shift resulted in decades of social distancing. And literally, I put that word in over a year ago before we were all social distancing with masks now. So they weren't running around wearing masks, not talking to each other, but they did create social distance. So unlike 50 years ago, Montana's archaeologists know relatively little now about sites on private lands, despite the fact that most of Montana's overall archaeological record exists physically on private lands. So we have a big gap in our knowledge, and it impedes our ability to interpret the past accurately. Which brings us back to my thesis. In many ways, the heritage preservation laws that were designed to preserve the physical remains of the past led to shifts in professional archaeological practice, which moved onto public lands, and this has had an adverse impact on professional-amateur relations in Montana, as well as the overall preservation of sites, especially those on private lands. Today, the Montana Archaeology Society is comprised primarily of professionals and graduate students, and only a handful of aging amateurs. And there are declining opportunities for engagement through collaboration. But now I want to finish up where I began, in Judith Gap. Last summer, in 2019, MSU conducted a field school at the bison kill site, the Bergstrom bison kill site, named for its discoverer. And we invited members of the local community to participate in the field work. Students from the school, as well as many folks from the surrounding ranches, came to visit and work at the site. By the end of the field season, many of David Bradley's neighbors began telling us about sites on their property and asking if we would like to come out and document them. And we would indeed like to do that. Together, MSU archaeologists and students in the community of Judith Gap are slowly building relationships of reciprocity and respect. And together, we're exploring the value of the past within the present and new ways to preserve a part of the past that might otherwise be lost. So thank you for listening, and thank you to the Western Heritage Center, the High Noon Lecture Series, everybody here that has helped and provided support. Thanks for filming this, and a whole slew of other people who have helped with my research. And I'm happy to stay here and take a few questions if there are any.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it sounds like I found it really interesting that the shift in meaning for pot hunter in Montana finally hits here that there is a distinction between amateur archaeologists and for-profit grave robbers, essentially. Have you been able to pinpoint the catalyst for the broader definition of the term to shift over and apply to those private?
It seems right around early 1960s is actually when pot hunter, once it starts being used here, it's kind of broadly applied to anybody that whatever they collect who isn't recording, working with an archaeologist, who's selling artifacts, anything like that. And so a lot of amateur collectors sometimes got thrown into that even though they weren't necessarily doing those things, but if they were collecting. A lot of people just got branded as being an unethical pot hunter so Oscar Lewis, though he was originally in an excavation, the WP excavations, later in his life as he continued to collect, he got rebranded. Instead of being an amateur and navigationalist, got rebranded as a pot hunter. So it really kind of happened late 50s, early 60s.
Do you think that that's sparked by more professional credentialed archaeologists coming into the area?
Absolutely. Because of those laws coming, it created work opportunities, and you all of a sudden had that, and I think it pushes out the balance. So it's who's available to do archaeology, the more strict permitting and educational requirements. And so that's why a lot of professional archaeology shifts to public lands, and amateur archaeology continues on private lands where there aren't any laws that are restricting what they can do. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So your presentation today, which is wonderful, really sounds like it focused in on indigenous sites, on native tribal sites. Is there any indication that we see it's extending into early homestead and early town site archaeology, or is that significantly later?
No, I think people but I mean, my period starts when we still have people homesteading in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So by the time we get to the 60s, what collectors are doing now, we definitely have people who are either looting or collecting historic sites in Montana. So by the time we get to the use of that term pot hunter, we have the same impacts on historic sites. Does that answer?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.